Talk us through the premise of the book then. So what were you trying to what do you want to achieve by writing this book?
Well, several things. Number one, I wanted to dispel a couple of the more salacious rumors surrounding Father Martin. Uh, many people said that he had, in fact, the New York Times came right out and said in their obituary, which was in error, grave error, but they came out and said in their obituary that he was living in a inappropriate relationship with a woman, and he was living there. And I just thought to myself, every time over the course of almost 10 years that I went up to see him, I ran into Mrs. Lavanos because, you've seen the apartment houses up on that part of Park Avenue, right? They owned an entire floor of one of those apartment houses. And he had this microscopic little studio apartment, sequestered away in part of that floor. Within their larger apartment, he had a microscopic little studio and an adjacent bathroom. Um, if anything, Mrs. Lavanos was the gatekeeper, and I like to say she kept the wing nuts at arm's length from Malachi, because he had this, out of the kindness of his heart, he had this habit whenever he would go, especially on Art Bell, of giving out his address. And he would give out, and one time he didn't give out his phone number. He gave out the phone number of his agent, Lila Karf. And she gets home and she finds that her answering machine is filled with 57 messages from people looking for Father Martin's help. But, Mrs. Lavanos, she was, if anything, a very steely, determined Greek woman. And her role with Malachi was just to protect him from the general public, because she knew that, given his nature, he would see or try to help everyone who contacted him. She knew that that just wasn't possible. All right. But there was nothing inappropriate. If anything, she was his landlady.
I think Malachi Martin was a lot of things to many people. You had your unique relationship with Malachi, Father Martin. Other people had their own unique relationships.
Yep.
What I've found since the release of the film is like that there's a lots of people that want to attack his character, and when you get more sort of investigate more into why they're saying the words that they're saying, they never actually had met the man, but they've got such a fierce opinion of what his character was. Why do you think there was such an attack on the man especially when he died?
I think the easiest way to put it is they hate the message that he stood for. And since in many ways you can't attack the message, because otherwise you're attacking very traditional Roman Catholic Christianity. Since you can't attack that, because if you are, you're attacking Jesus Christ. Instead of attacking that, you attack the messenger. You remember the old phrase, shoot the messenger.
Yeah.
That's exactly what it comes down to. That's where the hatred lies. If you cannot attack the message, attack the messenger. For me, the most difficult part of writing the book was gathering everything that I had known and remembered about the man and trying to put it in some sort of, I guess, logical sequence. And I ended up thinking, well, how did I first ever encounter him? And it was when I was in a junior in high school, and I had to go out and do a book report on a religion book. And it could be any topic as long as the top touched on religion. So I went to a little bookstore in my hometown of Westfield, New Jersey, and it was a little hole in the wall. And in the religion section that was maybe 13 books long, there was this book, Hostage to the Devil by Malachi Martin. And at the time, the front page read, the true story of the possession and exorcism of 5 living Americans. And to a 16-year-old kid, you know, that's like catnip to a cat, right? So, of course, I get that. And I became absolutely fascinated. I mean, I don't know if you have them over in the UK, but back then we used to have, these 50 cent comic books that were put out by DC or Marvel called Vault of Terror or Crypt of Horror.
Yeah.
I was raised on that stuff. So, that's why I immediately gravitated towards that book. But then after I read the book and I read just how deeply uh, critical or deeply important the topic of demonic possession was, that it wasn't something that Malachi would often say, and you've probably heard him say this phrase too, Frankenstein Dracula stuff, that it was something much more lethal because of the stakes involved, you know, I think you put this in the movie where I think Art Bell asked him, what is the end point of demonic possession? And Malachi himself said, uh, the end point of demonic possession is to destroy the soul and its will to resist so much that it must end up in hell. And I just thought the book itself was absolutely fascinating because, in many ways, it was a complete contradiction to the popular Hollywood culture at the time of what demonic possession was. And especially the end of the book, where it's entitled Human Spirit and Jesus and Human Spirit and Lucifer. I found that absolutely opened my eyes to a whole view, a transcendent view, if you will, of the Catholic religion, and where it stood as far as what it meant to be a Christian. So I thought, all right, that's my logical starting place because that's where I became familiar with the man. And you know how when we're younger, we all want to meet our idols,
Yeah.
right? And at the time, this is late 1970s. Reggie Jackson was the baseball slugger for the New York Yankees. All right. The Rolling Stones were big, Aerosmith, Bruce Springsteen. And I always thought if I could meet one person, anyone, it would be Malachi Martin. That's how strongly I felt about the impact the book had on me. And then it was maybe 14, 15 years later, where I actually had the opportunity while I was working for the agency uh, to meet Malachi. And we met over that dinner arranged by Father Perricone in, I think it was spring 1990 at the Isle of Capri in New York. And then from there, what I did was I just outlined sequentially what I thought were the most important points of not just his life, but my interaction with him, and the intersection of my life and his that I felt it worthy of being chronicled in a book. And I'm very grateful the book has been so well received. No, I was going to say, I just remember it wasn't just my interaction with him, but it was also things he had told me about his life and experiences that he had had in his life, such as a young teenage boy in the Irish Boy Scouts, traveling to the European continent in circa 1933-34 with his scout troop to meet Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini. That's crazy, but I thought that was significant and worthy of mentioning in the book. Because you want to talk about someone who was in certain ways an eyewitness to history. I think you could make a case that Malachi was that.
Let's eradicate a lot of misconceptions while I've got you, Robert. Let's talk
Go
about
for it.
where do you think he got his money from if he was not a part of the church anymore?
He got his money from royalties from his books because so many of them were bestsellers. In fact, most of his money, because the Lavanos family let him live rent free in that little apartment, and he was there for years. So most of his money he used to fund the support and expenses of elderly retired priests who were in nursing homes or certain priests who had been, as he would say, kicked to the curb by their bishop because they wouldn't get with the Vatican II program. And he told me, I believe he mentioned 85% of all the money he had went to that.
And sometimes he refers to himself as Dr. Malachi Martin. Can you sort of explain to the audience of where why he sometimes was known as Dr. Malachi Martin?
Sure. He had 3 doctorates. One from, I believe, one from Oxford, another from the University of Louvain in Belgium, and the third in ancient Semitic languages from Hebrew University in Jerusalem. So, you know, PhD, PhD, PhD. And so, sometimes for the purposes of either publicity or presentation, depending on the audience he was talking to, he was either, you know, Father Malachi Martin or Dr. Malachi Martin. He was usually Dr. Malachi Martin when he was representing one of his books, when he was making political commentary on TV, like for the visit of Pope John Paul II in 1995. But when he was talking to a more concentrated off audience of Catholics, he was Father Malachi Martin.
There was one incident that I really wanted to be able to prove, and it would have been very unprofessional of me to put it in the film without getting the facts. But it was the interaction with David Berkowitz in prison in the late 70s, I believe.
Yes.
Can you shed any light on that story with regards to the unfortunate thing was the prison, the original prison he went to see Berkowitz in burned down with all the paperwork and all the, obviously, the signing in papers, etc. So there was no way I could prove to the audience that Father Martin was present at that prison at that particular time, seeing that certain individual. Do you have any do you have any sort of stories? Although obviously you weren't there at the time, but do you have any more information about that event?
Yes. Uh, are you referring to the jail in Manhattan that they used to call the Tombs?
Was it the Attica prison? Was it Attica? Was it? I'm not
No,
sure.
Attica's upstate.
Upstate. But it was whatever the one that burned down, the original one where he went to. He was summoned by David Berkowitz, I believe, because they wanted an official sort of statement that he was perfectly possessed. But so that was one incredible story which I just could not prove. I would have loved to have proven that he was there.
Right.
I just couldn't put it in the film.
Well,
Although we did consciously make an effort to try and have it in the film, but it just wasn't. There wasn't enough proof for me to put it in the end.
right. No, he met with David Berkowitz. I believe he met with him on 2 occasions. And David Berkowitz wanted Malachi Martin, especially after the success of the book Hostage to the Devil. He wanted Malachi to write his biography, tell his story. Malachi refused. And Malachi told me that it probably would have taken 2 or 3 more multi-hour discussions with David Berkowitz. But from what he took away from his 2 meetings with him, he said that he was probably as good an example as any he had come across of the phenomena of what he had called perfect possession. And he told me that perfect possession was surrender of the will to Lucifer to the point that he said that the will was almost transferred to what Malachi called Lucifer's secure turf. You know the old saying, you never challenge evil on its own home turf. Well, he said that's what talking to David Berkowitz was like. That there was almost this understanding between them that David Berkowitz was over here and he was in a place that his will could not be touched. And I remember Malachi had told me that when people are perfectly possessed, and it's not a common phenomenon, from the movie that possession is not a common phenomenon. So if possession is, out of all the claims of demonic possession, if it represents that much of this many claims, and you have that much, then on that spectrum of authentic possession claims, you narrow it down to a much smaller possession of, sample of those people who are perfectly possessed. And when you're perfectly possessed, you can be a practicing churchgoer on Sundays. You can say the rosary along with everyone else. You can take communion. You can bless yourself with holy water. you can, to all outwards appearances, live a very Christian life. And you are not, that part of you that has been surrendered to darkness is not touched. It feels no ill effects. It's not like in the old horror movies where, they would put a cross up to a vampire and he'd run away screaming. It's not like that. Perfect possession imbues the person with the ability to practice the outward trappings, the visual trappings of Christianity, while still maintaining being in the secure grip of darkness. And he said David Berkowitz was.
Let's talk about his death, because you were pretty much very much there, not during the incident, but again, a lot of misconceptions surrounding Father Martin's death with regards to falling off a stool, was he assassinated, etc., etc. As you can imagine, a lot of the conspiracy theories, etc. So let's, obviously, again, this is just your subjective biased opinion, but you talk us through the Father Martin's death.
Sure. Malachi and I, we had birthdays that were in very close proximity to each other within, I believe, 2 days in late July. So instead of, exchanging gifts and that kind of thing, when you're a really good friend like that, you just would much rather just sit down and share a quiet meal in a restaurant. And that's how we celebrated our birthdays together. And we are due to do that, I believe, in late July of 1999. And one day towards the end of July, I got a call from him and his voice was very weak. And he just said, Rob, I've taken a bit of a tumble. And he said something to the effect, I'm paraphrasing, but he said something to the effect of, Old Scratch wasn't terribly happy with what we did when I went up to Connecticut last month. That refers to the possession case of the young girl talked about in the movie. He fell while reaching for a book in his library. He was on a short stool. He said he thought it had been kicked out from underneath him. And when he fell, he hit his head on the corner of a counter, a desk or something. But he suffered a what they call a subdural hematoma, a brain bleed. And he went to one hospital first. I don't remember which one it was. Maybe it was Mount Sinai. He was later transferred to Lenox Hill Hospital in New York City, where he's kept in intensive care. And he was there for 4 or 5 days. He slipped into a coma. And I remember going to see him the Sunday before he died. And he was unconscious. He had God knows how many machines hooked up to him. And I visited with him for about an hour. He never showed any signs of consciousness. And then afterwards, I left because the doctor was coming in to see him. And he passed away a day and a half later. And he died in the hospital. So there's nothing nefarious. He was not assassinated. No men in black came and visited him in the night. Nothing like that. He wasn't shoved down. I've heard stories that he was shoved down a flight of stairs. No, he wasn't. He fell off a piece of furniture. I almost feel apologetic. I'm sorry I can't give, people something much more dramatic, but because, falling off a piece of furniture, a little stool or something inside an apartment sounds kind of mundane when you compare it against some of the more fantastic stories that are out there. And they're all fiction.
Are you seeing anything that he warns about now in this day and age?
Mainly the loss of faith. The loss of faith, and how he even called it out back in the 1990s, that wholesale parts of the Catholic laity in the United States were being led into what he called practical apostasy. Because there's an old maxim in the Catholic Church called lex orandi, lex credenti. And all that means is the law of prayer mirrors the law of belief. The way you pray, the way you worship forms how you think. Your life, what you believe about the Catholic faith. And, do you remember you've probably at least heard of it, the American TV comedy from the 1970s with Archie Bunker called All in the Family?
Yeah.
Okay. It's iconic in the United States. He played, this, lower middle class, working class, Protestant fellow, who was rebelling against, the hippies and all that stuff. He was very against it. He was very old school 1940s, 1950s. He called his hippie son-in-law Meathead. In fact, the late Rob Reiner played him. He called him Meathead. And one episode, he was very concerned because his wife Edith, she was a little bit scatterbrained but very lovable. She started going to church with a Catholic friend, and Archie became very concerned. And finally, he gets down to the point of being so frustrated that she says, "Oh, I went to this meeting and it was so nice, and there were so many nice people there, and Father so and so was there." And Archie Bunker turns white with anger, and he's like, "For God's sakes, Edith, they didn't give you the little cookie, did they?"
Very good. Very good.
And unfortunately, a lot of Catholics came to believe that the host was no longer the body, blood, soul, and divinity of the Lord Jesus, but it was just, as Protestants believe, a symbolic memorial of the Last Supper. And that's where he said Catholics were led by the nose wholesale out of the Catholic faith. He believed that the watered down, changed liturgy after the Second Vatican Council had a lot to do with it. If you go to any regular English language Catholic mass now, when the time comes for communion, everyone out of habit gets up, and I don't mean to sound blasphemous, they get up and they go get their cookie. And the reason is because they don't truly believe. Because one of the things about the Catholic faith is that when you receive the Lord in Holy Communion, your soul is supposed to be in the state of grace. You are supposed to be in that spiritual condition where you are worthy, spiritually worthy of receiving the Lord in communion. Because, and I don't want to sound religious, but St. Paul tells us in the scriptures that one of the greatest spiritual dangers that Christians could do would be to receive the body of the Lord at the Lord's Supper, to receive the body of the Lord unworthily. He said, if you do so, if you receive the Lord unworthily, you receive him to your own condemnation. So before the Second Vatican Council, Catholics were more observant. I don't want to say they were scrupulous, but their consciences were just more well-formed. Now everyone gets up and marches up and receives communion. And, I've often wanted to ask priests, because when I would go to confession on a Saturday afternoon, maybe there'd be 3 or 4 people in line to go to confession the day before Mass. But the next day at Mass, everyone gets up and marches up there. So it's either, wow, everyone is saints, or they really don't believe anymore.
Yeah.
And he would definitely, he was calling that out in the 1990s. He was saying that's why, for people who he considered to hold what he called the true beliefs of the Catholic Church, which they existed after the Second Vatican Council. It's not like the church said, okay, we're canceling this, 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 and this. What they did was they just ignored the foundational beliefs of Catholicism, didn't preach them anymore. And after a while, people just didn't know about them. They were unaware. And that's why he said that, if for Catholics who still believed, he said they would need to seek out what he called the underground church. Priests, bishops, the Society of St. Pius X, clergy who still believed in what the dogmatic precepts of the church actually were. So many people think that there was such a cataclysmic break in the 1960s between what came before the Second Vatican Council and what came after, to the point where it's for many years, people felt they had to be obedient to the spirit of the council. It became this like lodestone to which became the center of Catholic life, and it effectively negated the 1935 years of Christian history that came before it. And it's not true. It's not true. He says, and that's why so many people have been led into apostasy. And that's why I wrote the addendum to the book, Father Malachi Martin's Spiritual Insights for Catholics in a Time of Uncertain Sacramental Validity.
We believe that he was writing some sort of like manuscript Catholic survival manual for the future, and obviously that all missing when he died, and his apartment was ripped out and was cleaned out. Can you shed any light on what this manuscript was? What was the essence of it? What was he trying to achieve by this his last book, in a sense?
His last book was going to be a combination of two things. Number one, a factual telling about how, by the turn of the last millennium in the year 2000, because that's when it would have been published, how the Catholic Church had become a creature of the New World Order, how it had in many ways become secularized and attuned to the New World Order. You remember his book, The Keys of This Blood?
Yeah.
Where the subtitle was the competition between the capitalist West, Mikhail Gorbachev, and Pope John Paul II for control of the New World Order. And that was written in the 1980s. And by 1999, he came to the firm belief that the Catholic Church had lost that battle because it specifically chose to engage those worldly powers, again, on their secure turf, in the secular world, with no reference to transcendent reality that exists beyond death. When you throw that out, you're basically saying, I'm going to bring an empty gun to a gunfight.
So how does Russia and Ukraine war at the moment tie in with the New World Order, their agenda?
Malachi said that it was actually part and parcel of what was mentioned in the Third Secret of Fatima. And he also, when someone said, well, could you be more specific on how they figure into the Third Secret of Fatima? He said, I would love to, but it would take me too far afield into the area of papal secrecy that I'm not permitted to divulge. They figure into it very much so. A third world war, I like to think that cooler heads would prevail when you start talking about weapons of mass destruction. I think it's gravely irresponsible for Russian President Medvedev, not Putin, but President Medvedev or former President Medvedev, to come out and say, if you cross certain red lines, then, the gloves come off and we start launching nuclear weapons. I think that's gravely irresponsible, because I think there's no such thing as a 1 or 2 time isolated detonation of a tactical nuclear weapon. I think once you start popping off nuclear weapons, the gloves are off and, you're on a very slippery slope to Armageddon. It's a very frightening topic. There are no winners in a nuclear war. None.
If we can just finish with the book, bring the audiences back to, obviously, there's the new book that's out now about Malachi Martin, a memoir about his life. Can you wrap up the podcast with, again, a summary of what audiences are expect to read when they have this through their post box?
Sure. I think when they get the book and they read it, and when they get to the end, they will realize, hopefully, because this is my intent, hopefully that I've painted a picture of a man who is much more nuanced and much more human than people give him credit for. That there was a very human side to his personality, which is why I came to think of him almost as a surrogate grandfather. He was, and he would come to my family's house out in New Jersey to visit my parents on several occasions. And it was great. He was like sitting around the dinner table like he was one of the family. And he really was. He was a very warm human man And, do you remember in the Gospels how the crowds would follow Jesus from place to place to place?
Yeah.
And the Catholic theology is that every priest is supposed to be an alter Christus, another Christ on his ordination. Ordination changes the priest's soul in a way we can't see. And looking back now, the way people, I don't want to say they'd kill, but they would do almost anything to be able to spend time with Malachi Martin. And I think it was because ontologically, when he became ordained, that the Lord saw he would have a special destiny. So the Lord took a little eyedropper and put 1/1,000,000th of his own charisma onto Malachi Martin, because he knew he would need that in order to bring his message to people through his servant, Father Malachi. And I think people will take away a new warmth, a new appreciation for what they've previously seen as a very mysterious character, that there was a very human side to him. There was a side that people could relate to outside of being a man of faith and a papal advisor and an exorcist and an author, that there was a human man there that I was very privileged to know and to be friends with. And, like I said in the book, to love as a surrogate grandfather and best friend.